to Drifting Deeper, a podcast about consciousness, culture, and human potential. I'm Nick, and I'm coming to you from California. I'll be your host today. This is a solo show, so I do hope you're already falling in love with the sound of my voice. And if you're not, let me know. I'll see what I can do to fix that. Go ahead, sit back and relax, because today I'm sharing with you a couple of mindset techniques I like to use with helping some of my clients in my hypnotherapy and coaching practices set a few things straight that they tend to experience from time to time. I do hope this will come in handy for you as well. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get on with the show. So today I wanted to talk a bit about the concept of the self-narrative. Now, the self-narrative is a really neat framework to operate in when we're looking at change work, and it's something I use fairly often when I work with clients. It works really well with young people, but that's not to say that people out of their early 20s or so can't use it, because it's hell on wheels for them as well. A self-narrative is essentially the story you tell yourself about yourself. So if you have a self-narrative that is working against you, you might have somewhere developed a habit of telling yourself that you don't deserve to be happy. And of course, once you do that, you unintentionally set your unconscious into motion to kind of handicap you and move you in the direction of being unhappy throughout your life. Of course, it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy when that type of pattern happens. And of course, we all know the stories about athletes who succeed because they tell themselves that they can succeed while they train in order to succeed. That's another self-narrative. The super successful business people who tell themselves they can succeed at an outrageous goal that they set themselves, and they end up succeeding because they train themselves into a positive self-narrative that allows them to move forward into that success. So self-narrative is a really fantastic tool to cultivate. And I've got 5 mindset changes that can help people out with getting into a better self-narrative when somebody's stuck in the cycle of telling themselves they're not worthy of something, or they're not a good person, or they're not deserving of compassion, love, or forgiveness. All that silly stuff that people get in their heads sometimes. These are things I usually end up helping clients with using this particular approach, and it's something we all go through at some point in time. So I'm going to run through it with you today. Like I said, there's 5 different portions of this, so sit back, relax. We'll go over some fun stuff. So mindset number 1 is to remember that everyone fails in some way, shape, or form in their life. A lot, actually. Failure is it's a normal part of life. Sometimes you fail to achieve a goal, sometimes you fail to set a goal, sometimes you make a choice somewhere along the way, consciously or unconsciously. And that choice takes you in a different direction than you had originally intended to go. But the really important thing to understand about failure is that failure in no way, shape, or form ever makes you unworthy of happiness, love, or respect. Now, that sounds pretty obvious on the surface, but I normally see this in people who have a tendency to fall into a depression or a depressive state, or who already were in a depressive state, and a failure kind of spins them off into this deeper depression. And that kind of depression tends to stem from what they perceive, correctly or incorrectly, as a failure in something that was important to them. Maybe a relationship went south, or maybe they didn't get into a school they wanted, or didn't get the job they wanted, and they tend to take those things personally. Now, fairly often, the people in those states, they know the right things to say, and they know the right things to do to get out of their funk. But they tend to lack the motivation to get up, get moving, and they don't actually feel the changes that they need to occur in order to get them out of the depressive spiral that this type of pattern tends to throw people into. Now, fairly often, people in that type of depressive state, they'll attempt to kind of put whatever happened in the past behind them by distracting themselves from the event. A really good example is a person who gets divorced, and you see this fairly often over longer periods of time in men than in women, in my experience. A divorcee throws themselves into their job in order to avoid acknowledging that they now have this massive empty spot in their life where they used to have someone. So someone may go from working 40 hours a week to working 50 to 60, even 80 hours a week in order to give themselves something else to focus on and not have to go home to, an empty home and have to deal with that type of trauma in their life. It's a way of forestalling having to deal with those emotions. A lot of young people these days have a similar thing where they're forestalling the pain and the change that they have to go through as they grow up by getting stuck into video game obsessions or pop culture obsessions. Now, there's a double-edged sword in pop culture obsessions. On the one hand, a lot of them really do prevent people from maturing in a healthy, dignified manner. Video games which are not linked to violence even slightly, just to be clear on that. But they do have addictive qualities to them that some people can get sucked into on. And they actually end up being just like the divorcee I mentioned. They do tend to be a distraction to keep people from facing what they need to face and moving forward in their lives. And of course, there's all sorts of other distractions people can get sucked into. Drug use, alcohol abuse, shallow, useless relationships, or sexual acting out. All these types of things can divorce somebody distract somebody from the type of pain that they're feeling, or trying to not feel, either way. Problem is, you just can't indulge in that kind of distraction for very long without having some very serious consequences to your emotional, social, or physical health. If you need to move forward from a trauma in a healthy way, you need to confront how your past has an effect on your emotional responses in the present. You don't necessarily have to go back and revisit the traumatic event time and time and time again. That's just not healthy. You shouldn't go back and relive things that you didn't enjoy over and over. But you do need to address how it's informing your present actions. So, one really powerful method I use with clients to do this is to walk them through a type of review of whatever it is they feel is traumatic or is the failure, and have them reframe it verbally with themselves. And the most important thing that I like to tell my clients is, do not use the word should. Most especially not the phrase I should. Because we all know when something doesn't work out right, oftentimes we'll say, I should have done it this way. An athlete might say, I should have been stronger, I should have been faster, I should have trained harder. In a failed relationship, you might say, I should have listened more, I should have been home more, I should have paid more attention. And these type of traps, these shoulda traps, are just pure nonsense. There's something that our ego spins off in order to indulge in its weird Thanatosian urge to continually just beat on itself. And in a way, you can make the argument that that urge exists in order to help us improve and avoid the same behavior in the future, but it very rarely turns out that way, doesn't it? Instead, you're just hammering yourself over and over and over, telling yourself shoulda, coulda, woulda. But of course, it's too late. Whatever it is already in the past. And telling yourself shoulda does not teach yourself how to move forward in the future. So instead of the shoulda, woulda, couldas, what you can do is cultivate an observant nature while you do a type of review of the experience. You can walk through your memory a couple of times with it if you like. I definitely recommend doing it with a therapist of some type, or at least with a friend who's willing to sit down and give you a compassionate ear. And instead of wandering through the should haves or could haves or maybe this or maybe that, just observe the memory. And look at it from a point of view that allows you to build an understanding of why you reacted or acted or failed to act in the way that you did at the time that whatever traumatic event it was happened. I had a client who needed some help with grief once, as an example. He had just recently been divorced, as so many people are these days. And he was quite full of the shoulda, coulda, wouldas. And unfortunately, as happens in many relationships, he simply wasn't able, because of financial necessity, to be as present for his wife as he wanted to be. And she ended up finding solace with someone else. And that's a completely understandable situation for both people. Of course, I never take sides in those things, but it's the way relationships fall out sometimes. And he had been beating himself up for quite some time with, I should have been home, I should have worked less, I should have gotten a job that paid more so I could have been home, and he was rather creative, so of course he just kind of kept spinning off in these different kind of, shoulda, woulda, couldas. So when he was working with me, we walked him through a couple of primary events that he had stored and kept coming back to in his shoulda, woulda, couldas. And we stopped him from thinking of his particular role in things in that context, and instead helped him build a better understanding of the situations that led to the divorce. Why it was that he had to work, and how he could have changed things, and how he can change things in the future, but most importantly, how that was simply the way the situation was at the point in time. Shoulda, woulda, coulda does him no good at all. But with insight on how and why he reacted to, the arguments that happened, to the big blow up that happened when he found out about his wife's infidelity, that type of thing. Reframing that in a way that removed that feeling of unnecessary guilt or responsibility, that helped him move all of that out of the way so that he could come to a better understanding of himself and allow himself to forgive himself. Both of the things that he felt he shoulda, woulda, coulda done, but also from all that pointless guilt that he had been trapped in by continually hammering on himself with that shoulda, woulda, coulda pattern. Now, it's super important to understand with this technique, the end goal is to remove yourself from the guilt that inevitably people feel for failing. Because that guilt will ruin you. It's part of what the ego uses as a fuel to continually bash itself with. And we need to understand the shoulda, woulda, coulda mindset. That's just it's a plague on some of the most strongest and most talented people that I know. I've known some people who spend, a lifetime honing skills that, should have seen them through to success in a situation exactly when it didn't. And of course, it's not their fault that it didn't go through when it didn't. Oftentimes, in the case of a few athletes I work with, oftentimes the other athlete just had a genetic advantage. Or oftentimes, somebody simply had a training advantage. Or they were off that day, or something happened that is entirely not their fault. but because they think they should have won, or shoulda, coulda, woulda done better, well, then they just end up beating on themselves. Now, the more successful a person is, the more likely they are to kind of take a sense of inappropriate responsibility for events that they just have no control over, and well, they just kind of punish themselves after the supposed failure for a long time. And I know I'm going over that point again and again, but it's important for us to understand, because that is such a human response, isn't it, to just beat on ourselves for a failure? Really, it's kind of it's a trap that your shadow lays. Shadow in the Jungian sense, not the thing behind you on a sunny day. And that shadow trap tends to tell people that they fall short of who they were supposed to be. You know, we're all supposed to be winners. We're all supposed to be people who get whatever we want in life because we just try harder, or whatever nonsense we like to subscribe to. But what we need to remember is this person who we are supposed to be doesn't freaking exist. It's completely a figment of the imagination and a social construct that's made. And it's this unattainable thing that we like to, on some level, kind of play the game where we think, one day I will be the person I should be, but we never set up a goal for who we should be, do we? We always just define that by our failures. Well, I shouldn't be a person who fails, and yet I am. It's such a nasty cycle. Now, falling short of any goal, whether it's a business goal, an athletic goal, a relationship goal, any of that is it's completely human. It's part of being a human. It's the experience of growing up, and no one ever stops failing. And really, failure is so valuable when we actually integrate and calibrate it into our lives correctly. It's critical that we fail hundreds of times more than we succeed, because that's what gives us our data as to what doesn't work. It's what helps us define ourselves in the sense of, well, who we are. Not who we should be, but who we are. And who we are is somebody that always has to remember that no matter how many failures we make, no matter how big a cluster F we cause or get ourselves into, we are all still very worthy of self-forgiveness and self-love. It's the pursuit of being that imaginary person that we should be, or we wish we were, that makes us worthy of this. It's the pursuit of it. It's not being, it's not becoming. It's the fact that we continually do things to make ourselves better. That is what makes us worthy of that forgiveness and that self-love. Now, the second mindset I want to go into today is looking at yourself the same way that you would look at someone that you already have a lot of love for, like a friend or a spouse or a loved one of any type. See, sometimes after someone experiences a trauma or a loss, oftentimes people have a really unfortunate tendency to compound that trauma with a type of corresponding moral failure by projecting their hurt and their anger off to other people. And everybody knows this. Everybody's got, stories where some person that they know went through some type of loss, and suddenly they turned very angry to everyone else and got nasty, started taking their hurt out on other people. Ideally, not physically, but sometimes some people just get nasty to be around because they've experienced a loss and they don't know how to process that. Now, that type of thing is oftentimes where we see marriages or other social relationships just fall apart after a really tragic event. Just basically something happens and then someone turns into a jerk right when their support is needed the most, and everything just kind of crumbles. And it's really heartbreaking from any point of view to see this type of thing happens, but we need to understand that's a completely normal response. It's understandable, and provided, nobody's out there actively harming anyone, there's no reason to really feel guilty about it. And I'm going to say that again, because that's real important. In most cases, guilt has no context in that. It's not appropriate to apply guilt to yourself. It's okay to feel that pain, even if you're not able to deal with it immediately. You end up pointing it at other people. That's normal. Throwing guilt into that just isn't going to help at all. It's just going to make things worse. But while guilt isn't appropriate, taking responsibility is. See, a lot of people are much, much harder on themselves than they would be on a friend for doing the exact same behavior. Oftentimes people will beat on themselves for, if you remember high school, for beating on themselves for failing a test, whereas they would instantly be there for a friend who failed the very same test in the very same class. And isn't that weird how we do that? But it's just part of our hardwired egocentric viewpoint, or the tendency to view the world from your own point of view, which is what egocentric means, not the vernacular in which it's used as an insult. And that's where taking responsibility really starts to come into play in dealing with trauma and how you respond to it. Because when it comes to a friend or a loved one, we can always see that they're not bad people, and they make those same foibles and screw-ups as any other human being, and very, very rarely do we decide that someone we love is beyond redemption. But when we look at ourselves, we withhold that forgiveness and that compassion. And sometimes we have this ridiculous belief that being hard on ourselves will make us better in the future, or we'll be hard on ourselves because, we think we should have been better. There's those shouldas again. Or we think we deserve it more than anyone else because we have this concept of responsibility for whatever situation as it turned out. And that's the type of thing that really spins off into the projection that I was just mentioning, when we start lashing out at other people because we can't process that pain of whatever trauma or whatever loss it was that went through. And there's a real good disassociative technique I use in cases like this. So there's two different ways to do it. When I work with somebody hypnotically, I'll have them sit down with an empty chair, and I'll have them in a hypnotic trance. They'll see themselves sitting in a chair, and they'll communicate with themselves. Now, you can do this non-hypnotically as well. You do need to be comfortable looking at yourself in a mirror, which a lot of people staring at themselves in a mirror for a prolonged period gets a little weird sometimes, but practice makes perfect, and I definitely recommend giving it a try. So either picture yourself sitting across from you, or go to a mirror and stare at yourself, and talk to that self-image as if it were your friend. That's where the disassociation comes in. You need to treat this reflection or this other image of yourself as a friend, not yourself. And you need to let yourself say and hear everything that you would say to a friend who is in the same position you're in. So, for example, if you know you're in a bad relationship and it's the type of relationship you would recommend a friend get the hell out of, go to a mirror, look yourself in the mirror, and tell yourself as compassionately as possible, "Hey, friendo, you know what's going on, right?" Spend as much time as you need to break that down. It sounds pretty silly talking to yourself. I fully get that. And, do it when no one else is around if you're super shy about that kind of thing, or just do it internally. But it's super important to have that conversation with yourself. And this is a really good way to build that particular skill, communicating with yourself. Most people, they'll have a much easier time with self-compassion, self-forgiveness, motivation, and such through this disassociative technique than just with simple self-talk. I mean, how many times have you said something derogatory to yourself as some type of half-assed means of motivation? A really good way, of course, is, if you have a problem with sleeping in, like I sometimes do, since I tend to burn the candle at both ends. Oftentimes you'll say something like, get your dumb ass out of bed. I say that one to myself sometimes. Or if you do something that you regard as dumb, you might get on your own case. That's self-talk. That's not conducive to progress. So instead, use a technique like this. Separate yourself from the concept of yourself and address it as if you're talking to someone else that you love unconditionally. And you'll find that after a few tries, that technique will open up new avenues of self-compassion, self-forgiveness, and a better understanding of yourself in general. Now, what's real important about this, and I mean real important, is after you forgive yourself, do not use that forgiveness as an excuse to continue doing all the bad behaviors that you had to forgive yourself for. So, if you need to forgive yourself for projecting onto other people while you're so grumpy and angry over a loss, move forward from that point and help yourself, I should say, work on resolving that anger and that projection. Don't keep getting angry at people, lashing out, and then go and forgive yourself, and then get angry, lash out, and then go and forgive yourself. Yeah, don't get stuck in that cycle. It's just bad for everyone. So the next mindset I like to use is to help people accept responsibility for the future. Oftentimes, people will fall into a faulty thought pattern that allows them to say things like, oh, I'm not that kind of guy, when it comes down to accepting some responsibility for actions or inactions or failures. And that kind of thought pattern is usually used to distance themselves from the possibility that they're capable of committing a certain act. For example, you might say, oh, I'm not the kind of guy who's capable of screwing over a friend in a business deal. And then you end up just doing exactly that. Or you might say, oh, I'm not the kind of person that would make a bad choice and gamble a little too much and lose vacation money in Vegas. And then, of course, you end up doing that because you were just not prepared for the onslaught of advertising and hypnosis that's used in the Vegas gambling industry. So oftentimes people will use that I'm not that kind of person pattern to try to distance themselves from the absolute reality that they are capable of committing particular acts that they never even thought themselves capable of committing. Now, there's also a weird inverse use of that, which is related to some of the things that I was talking about previously, where a person will say, oh, I'm not that kind of person that can get all touchy-feely with themselves. I had a client like that once. It was an older lady, and she had a really bad habit of beating up on herself for particular problems in her life, nothing too heinous, but she also had a tendency to try to take on the failures of her children as well. And when I was trying to help her disassociate herself from her adult children's lives, so that she didn't feel the need to take that responsibility on, she told me she's not that kind of person who can get all touchy-feely with herself. and deal with things like that. So, of course, my response to that is, well, are you the kind of person who enjoys continually pummeling yourself emotionally instead of moving forward and maturing? And that, of course, very much got her attention. She got a little angry at that because it sounds a little glib on the surface, but it's important that people feel that kind of thing and frame their self-understandings outside of that type of distancing technique. And those techniques, they're really effective, saying I'm not that kind of so-and-so, because there's a simple beauty to that statement in its simplicity, because it has a way of saying that their personality is completely fixed, completely immutable, and also completely out of their control. Oh, I can't do, a marathon run because I'm not that type of person. And I work with some athletes. I help people lose weight. I've had people say, oh, I'm not an athletic type of guy. One of my favorite stories was I was working with a guy over the course of, close to a year. He said, well, I'm not that kind of person. I can't really get athletic. I just want to lose a few pounds. 40 pounds later, and almost a year later, he was running marathons. Now, he was absolutely right when he started. He was not that kind of person at that point in time. But he could damn well become that type of person. And that's what's important to understand, is that the whole I'm not that type of person is just a justification to avoid making a strenuous effort of facing up to their own responsibility and changing themselves and improving themselves. That type of statement also has an effect of distancing the egocentric self from the concept of that kind of person, right? So you could say I'm not that kind of person, and linguistically, when we break that down, you're completely othering a type of person. You're making yourself separate from that. And that's going to build a type of emotional buffer between themselves and that concept that really just kind of strengthens that thought that the personality is completely fixed. Now, because of that othering effect, and because it functions as a type of identity statement, which are some of the most powerful statements we can ever make, is the statement, I am XYZ. This type of mindset can actually be self-sustaining, and if you let it, it'll last your entire lifetime. That's got pros and cons to it. Now, if we accept the nonsensical and disproven thought that personality is immutable, that it's fixed, and you've got a crap personality, you're someone no one wants to be around, do you want to be that person for your entire life? Heck no, you don't want to be that person your entire kind of life. That's a miserable existence. No friends, no loved ones. No. But when you accept that you may not be that kind of person currently, but you can be that type of person, and you're deciding that type of person is something you want to be, well then, that's fantastic. You can become that kind of person and be that type of person, because any mindset can be self-sustainable. Now, it's important to understand that this mentality comes in all sorts of forms. A person can think they're too weak, too dumb, too mean, or too old to change, or inversely, they can think that they are not smart, strong, or young enough to achieve, and the statement is the same and just as inaccurate. Truth is, we can always change. We just have to want to. We just have to see how, and we just have to have the right tools to follow up. So never, ever get in the habit of telling yourself you are not any type of person. Because the human experience is so flexible, so variable. You can do so many things. Don't ever lock yourself down by saying you can or cannot do a thing. Because if you say you're incapable of doing something bad and you end up doing something bad, say you're never capable of sucker punching someone, and then somebody pushes your buttons the wrong way, and you throw a punch one day, you're going to be shocked and horrified that that's inside you. Conversely, if you ever say you're not somebody who's capable of achieving a goal that you really want to achieve, you're never even going to try for that goal, and you're never going to achieve it. So don't be that person either. Simply acknowledge you're fully capable of doing just about anything in this world. And you may not be able to do it now, but if you take responsibility for the future, you certainly can. Now, there's another type of pattern I want to bring up on this subject. And that's when people start blaming external factors for internal decisions. And that's a real common pattern, probably more so than the other pattern, because the other pattern functions on identity statements, but the ability to blame an external factor for your internal decision can become an identity statement. So a lot of times people will say things like, for example, someone wanting to be an entrepreneur might say, I can't start that business because I'm too poor and I don't have startup funds. Or the real famous, my parents didn't love me when I was a child, so I don't know how to love as an adult. That was a real popular one in the pop psychology years. There's one, of course, that actually has some points, but it's still misused, and that's the whole, I come from the bad socioeconomic background, that type of thing. Now, the thing is, all those statements might be factually true, but realistically, they are much more of a mental impediment than a physical one. Now, there are probably strong, structural reasons or factors that get in the way of you becoming a version of yourself that you want to be, but not a damn one of those reasons are an absolute guarantee that you cannot become the best version of yourself. But they can be really powerful excuses for not making the attempt. So, of course, because hypnotists are always asking how we can utilize things, mental phenomena, the question is, how do we leverage this phenomenon? How do we utilize it for a benefit? And that's actually surprisingly easy. What you actually need to do, and this is not necessarily a hypnotic technique so much as a coaching fact, if you start building up a series of successes that disprove the faulty narrative, that faulty narrative is going to fall apart. It cannot stand in the face of concrete reality. And that's just plain and simple. I had a student in my one of my martial arts classes a bunch of years ago. Very out of shape young man. He had fallen into the video game pop culture trap. And he would make it a habit to profess about how weak that he was, which was really irritating to me. Here he was coming to learn how to defend his life and practice a martial art that I've dedicated my life to. And here he is telling me he can't do 10 push-ups. So what did I do? Of course, I had him do 10 push-ups every 20 minutes. Now, what was interesting about that was I started him off with 5 push-ups, and he struggled at 1 push-up. He was very much out of shape. But we took him from 1 to 5, and then we would train for 20 minutes, stop, have him do 5 more push-ups. Now, what was funny was that second 5 push-ups was much, much easier than the first 5 push-ups. And then next week, when I had him doing 10 push-ups, he's sitting there and he's busting out his push-ups. And he stopped in the middle of it, and I'm like, why are you stopping? Obviously, I didn't tell him to stop. And he said, I just realized this is something I could have always done. It's not comfortable. It's not easy. But I just did 40 push-ups, and I didn't think I'd be able to do more than 5. And of course, being a hypnotist and a martial artist, I immediately grabbed on that and I explained to him, I'm like, okay, you've got a small victory. This is something that you did not think that you could do. What else do you think it is that you can't do? And he thought about it for a minute and he said, probably run a half mile. And I said, you mean run a mile? And he said, no, run a half mile. And I said, I hear run a mile. So we took him over to the gym and we put him on a treadmill and he was surprised. It was a very slow jog compared to how other people can run, but he's not competing against anyone. He's only competing against who he thought that he was. It's those small victories that pile up. It's those small victories that help you redefine what you understand that you are capable of. And not just what you're capable of. Once you get a pile of victories that you can stand on and move on to greater victories and move on to greater successes, you can change that narrative. You can literally change who you think you are and what you think your limits are. And what's really awesome is the harder the conditions that you conquer, the greater the change in that personal narrative you'll see. Some of my weight loss clients, for example, they'll come into me and they'll be ranging anywhere from a few pounds overweight to needing to lose 100 plus pounds. And once they lose the first 5 to 10 pounds, they'll usually, with a change in diet and exercise, oftentimes people will lose 5 to 10 pounds within a week or two because your body loses water weight very quickly. Things will slow down a little bit, but they'll maintain steady pressure on the weight loss after that. But the bigger that number of pounds lost gets, the easier it gets to keep losing weight. And part of that is physiological, of course. Their metabolism is speeding up. It's burning a lot more calories. They're carrying less weight, so they're exercising more. I mean, there's a huge biological portion to that. But the most important thing is they've changed their narrative. They have concrete evidence they can do something, and they're moving forward into a new version of themselves. Now, there's another trick to dealing with false narratives. Oftentimes we will hear like a judgmental voice in our heads. And I fully realize, having a background in psychology, that the words voice in your head have a certain meaning to them. I don't mean hallucinations. I mean that voice in your head that tells you that you aren't good enough. A voice that pops up in your head that says, I knew you'd screw it up again. That type of voice. What I want you to do the next time you hear that, pay attention to the quality of the voice and where you feel like you're hearing it from. 9 times out of 10, when I ask a client that, they hear a voice that is deeper than them, coming from behind and above them. And here's why that's really common. Because when they were kids, their parents probably made a side comment out of frustration or anger of a child doing what child do, dropping something, breaking something, making a mess, whatever. And as a child, they heard that. And because they learn as a child by mimicking their parents, they take that information in, it becomes part of their identity statement, and decades later, they're using it as a reinforcement to a negative identity narrative. So when you listen to those voices, listen to what they say and realize that you can change qualities of those voices. You can make them ridiculous. You can make them quiet. You can even change what they say if you want. All you need to do is sit down, take some time, listening to those voices, disassembling their qualities, and changing them. Now, oftentimes those voices will stir up some memories that come with that particular type of thing. After all, these are most often childhood experiences. So it's not the easiest thing to do. Sometimes those memories have a little pain attached to them, but that's okay. It's okay to sit with those memories, sit through the experience and the feelings that come with them. And sometimes you have to re-experience those particular things. But what's important is that after you go through those memories, take the time to thank the version of you that went through that. Because they went through that when they were younger. Or because another version of you between when you were a child and your current age kind of took the emotional hit by sticking to that identity statement. They were trying to stay in a model of reality to keep you safe and protected from changing your sense of identity, which can be a traumatic thing. You can thank them for that. You can thank them for making you stronger. And you can let them know that you've got it from here and you can move forward. You're stronger now because of what that younger version of you went through, and whatever that voice is tied to can't hurt you anymore, and you can move on. So those are some really good ways to take responsibility for your current state and into your future. And a fourth mindset, and this one gets, a lot of people try to get controversial on this one with me. It's having an enlightened and healthy selfishness. Now, I want to specify, this has nothing to do with Ayn Rand's concept of benevolent selfishness or Gordon Gekko's greed is good nonsense. It absolutely is not good. But there is a certain mistake a lot of therapists make in any field when they first set out, where they try and take as many clients on as they can because they want to help as many people as they can. And I've known people who will see upwards of 30, I've even heard upwards of 40 clients a week. And I want you to think about the type of stuff you're putting yourself through, seeing 40 people a week coming to you, trying to tell you all the bad stuff that's happened in their lives or all the problems that they have. And even in mild consideration, you can realize how quickly a therapist of any stripe can burn out from that type of thing. So therapists have, or good ones I should say, have a concept of healthy, enlightened selfishness where they allow themselves only X number of clients over a given amount of time, usually over a week. And that's important to take that time, because if you burn yourself out, what good are you to your clients? What good are you to the people you need to take care of? If you're a parent and you're continually giving everything you can to your child to the point to where you're exhausted, and I know there's a lot of exhausted parents out there, what good are you to your child if you're too exhausted to spend time with them? I know that sounds a little weird because you can't avoid things like exhaustion, but that's the kind of thing that you have to do, is to separate yourself, take a little bit of time to recharge so that you can come back into a situation and be 100%. I mean, how useful are you if you're crippled by the need to always provide for others, financially, emotionally, physically, whatever matter? I mean, how useful are you? How much can you help anybody if you're not helping yourself? If you're continually giving from yourself, what can you do for other people once you run out? We have this weird tendency in America to self-sacrifice ourselves. We see it in our hero stories. We see it in industry where employers are always encouraging employees to go the extra mile. No motivation to do so, of course. No overtime, no bonuses, nothing like that. Just go that extra mile. And we always have this weird drive to just give and give and give and give. But the fact is, self-sacrifice for its own sake, just for the sake of being the person who makes the self-sacrifice, that's not noble. It's stupid and it's selfish. Because I know it sounds weird to say self-sacrifice is selfish, but in a certain light it is. And a lot of our social myths kind of focus around the thought that self-sacrifice is necessary in every single occasion to do good in this world. And there's no shortage of people who throw themselves against a ridiculous, almost insurmountable number of stresses. And they just throw themselves into, crap situation after crap situation after crap situation because that's what we're trained to do, and they burn themselves out. But here's the odd truth you might not have considered. You can be selfish and still be a good person. And I want you to think about that. I don't mean be selfish as in, taking the few odd moments a month for self-care. And I don't mean the ridiculous concepts that we have where people give themselves occasional splurges on, say, a diet or something like that. Well, I've been good on my diet, or one slice of cake won't kill me. That's not the type of selfishness I'm talking about. I'm talking about setting aside a set amount of time to pursue your goals, to take care of yourself, with the deliberate intent of being able to come back to what it is you're doing to do good in the world as a person who's recharged and able to offer more to the world. And the context of whatever it is you're interacting in that you need to do good in, that doesn't matter. Context is a bit irrelevant. Lots of people that I teach this to like to claim that relationships are the exception to the rule. This is a really good example, especially in younger people who are not experienced in relationships, because how rom-coms and love songs teach people you have to always be giving. You have to always give 120% to the person and always be there and, provide for them everything you can and be the person who gives away everything and all that kind of crap. And I never hesitate to break that belief in a young person and save them years of heartache. Because there is a very specific truth to being selfish that is very important in relationships. And that truth is that if you are not making a deliberate, concentrated effort to take care of yourself, you are not offering the best version of yourself to whoever it is you need to. That's kind of a weird thought, right? Like, obviously, if you're in a relationship with somebody you love, you want to give the best version of yourself. But sometimes to do that, you have to distance yourself from them and be unavailable while you're being selfish in some ways. And ultimately, the balance between how much effort you put into yourself versus how much effort you put into others, that's a falsehood. That's ridiculous. I want to say false dichotomy, but I think that's not quite the false dichotomy, but along those lines. Instead, try and look at it this way. If you are selfish enough to push yourself into the best version of yourself, you are offering a better version of yourself to everyone in your life. You can be the better version of yourself that's out there, acting as an inspiration to your young people. If you're a teacher, that's fantastic. You can be an inspiration to your students. If you're a parent or a foster parent, that's wonderful. Take some time to work on yourself, improve yourself as much as possible, because you aren't just providing, you are setting an example for those people. Now, of course, there's a trap to the concept of enlightened selfishness. Like all things, the shadow will sometimes stick its hand in there. It's real easy to use enlightened selfishness as an excuse to just be a jerk and take advantage of others or deprive others of resources. We see that in corporate culture a lot, where CEOs will kind of nudge things in particular ways to ensure that they get more money, because after all, it's important for them to be well taken care of in order for them to run the company that provides jobs for everyone else. I've actually heard people use that as an excuse for some pretty ridiculous and obscene behaviors. I mean, it's pretty obvious, you can use enlightened selfishness to just be a selfish jerk and make that accommodation, and it's real easy to avoid doing that if you ensure the things that you are selfish for are only the things that make you able to do good in a better way. And you have to be honest with yourself with that. You have to sit down and tell yourself, I am doing this in order to be a better person in XYZ way. Be specific. Set those goals for yourself. What you'll find is that when you're selfish, it's okay, because you can come back and you can be better than you were before you started being selfish. And most importantly, when you're practicing enlightened selfishness, you have to remember it's okay to pursue what you want in the world. This is critical. I'm going to say that again. It's okay to pursue what you want in the world, regardless of what others think you should be doing. Now, earlier I said the concept of who you should be was absolute garbage. It does not exist, and that's very true. But there's another version of who you should be that exists in everyone else's head. And that person is every bit as imaginary. So, start your enlightened selfishness with telling yourself it's okay to pursue your goals and set your standards and do what you want in this world. It is your life. Do something with it. And of course, most importantly, make sure that everything is geared towards providing for yourself in a way where you can do the most good in the world for other people. And the last thing to focus on, number 5, this one borders on a little bit of woo-woo, but not in a unprovable way. See, the human mind, it does a really funny thing when it starts to focus on something. It's got this amazing ability to just zoom in on whatever you're focusing on and block out everything else. Think about the last time you were driving and thinking of something else. Of course, you remember what you were thinking of, and you darn well don't remember that road you were driving on, do you? It's kind of terrifying how often that happens, right? But that's what your mind does. It focuses on things and will block everything else out. And that, without a doubt, that helped our ancestors when they were having to just scrape a living out of a hostile environment that was full of predators and rivals and all sorts of dangers. And in today's modern world, that ability to focus really is probably one of the key factors that has given us our advantages and our changes and advancements in technology, philosophy, art, and all that stuff that makes this world such an interesting place. But that weird focus ability, that can be really detrimental as well. So, you see fear, nervousness, despair, all those types of negative emotions are very often the result of being too focused or focused too close on an issue, on a problem. And you end up looking at it through a type of cognitive zoom lens almost. And you're looking at it so closely that you fail to see the big picture because you're stuck in that focus mode and you're looking at the wrong thing. So think about the last time you were buried in bills. Yeah, I know that's not a pleasant memory. We've all been there. But you remember how that stress and that focus just kept coming back to those bills? You remember how that stress just kind of had that effect of your heart rate rising, your blood pressure changing, and maybe you noticed you were breathing a little faster, stuff like that. And then, of course, you just kind of kept focusing on that. That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. But the fact of the matter is, you've been buried in bills before, and you've gotten your way out of it. That's the thing that we don't focus on when we get narrowed into those, despairing states. Is the fact that we've gone through so much as individuals, as groups, and as a species, that we often forget that ultimately things will be okay. Yeah, it might be rough for a while, but when we zoom in on things, we often forget the massive amount of experiences and resources that we have as individuals or as groups. And when we focus on the problem, when we focus on the stressor, we're often doing that to the exclusion of all other things, especially the solution to the problem. 9 times out of 10, that's a statistic I use a lot, but it's accurate. we already know the solution to the problems that we go to other people for. Did you know that? I probably shouldn't tell you that. I hope now that I've said that I don't see like a decline in my client base, but oftentimes we already know the solution to the problems. We just have difficulty making the decision to utilize them. But because we focus on the problem so closely that we can't see the solution, we just end up blowing the problem so far out of proportion that we just kind of indulge in unnecessarily large amounts of stress. So when I have a client who's stuck in what I call a despair cycle, which is when they're focusing so tightly in on something that they can't see anything else, especially the solution, I have to help them develop a type of wider perspective so that they can't focus entirely on what's stressing them. And that wider view is what we can look back on, is when we can look back on previous events and see things have always been worse. See, things have a tendency to get better in life as you get older, even in your elderly years, despite what you've probably heard. Because as we get older, we've gone through more things, we've developed more tools, more techniques, more resources to employ to deal with stresses and problems. So as we get older, we tend to get more immune to everyday stresses that arise now and then. Now, you can use the fact that you can change your focus away from your stressors, and you can use the fact that as you grow, you develop more resources. And don't forget, when you're younger, I'm not saying you don't have resources, you absolutely do, and one of your best resources is the older people you know. I can guarantee there's no one on this world that is going through something that someone before them has not gone through before. That's a fact. Use those two factors, your life experience or access to other people's life experience, and your focus, to review the things that you think you're suffering from. Okay? Take a look at the situation, and then remember how many times you've been through it before and gone through. Talk to people who've been through it and succeeded. Find the patterns that they went through that got them out of it, and then do that. That's important. So many times we make plans to get out of trouble and stop focusing on things we don't need to focus on, but then we never follow through on the plan. That's the important thing. Do the action. Unless you're one of a small handful of people in this world, I can basically guarantee your life is not going to turn out the way what you expected or the way you wanted it to at first. And that's okay. It's natural, it's human. But if we remember to not focus on the painful things, if we remember to change our mindset, for example, using the 5 different mindsets I've gone through, we can find that we can move through our lives much more gracefully. We don't have to focus on the painful things. We can always keep moving. We can always keep growing. We can always become that person that we want to be, not who we think we should be. And on that note, I've been talking for about an hour now, and I want to say thanks for hanging in there and listening to me. It's just as good for me to say these things and get those thoughts and vibes out there as it is for some people who need to hear it. I always appreciate when somebody is willing to spend an hour or so listening to me talk about it. I'm going to go ahead and let you go on your way now. I do hope this advice has helped you out some, or will find a place in your life where it'll help you out at some point. Why don't you go out there, have yourself a great day, a great life. Remember to take some extra effort these days to love each other and love yourselves. Bye now.